A quiet evening drive with her son turned into a nightmare when police stopped their car and slammed the teenager against the hood. The officers had no idea who was standing just a few steps behind them, and within seconds, everything spiraled out of control. What happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe, leave a like, and comment where you're watching from. Would you be able to stay calm in Ronda's place? The last glow of the sun was fading when their car rolled onto the long stretch of empty road that curved through the outskirts of the city. The horizon still held a warm band of orange, but the sky above it had already shifted into deepening blue, the first stars faintly pulsing through the veil of twilight. The air outside seemed calm, almost suspended, as if the world were holding its breath before night took full control. Inside the car, the soft hum of the engine blended with the faint melody coming from the radio, creating a quiet rhythm that matched the steady breathing of the young driver. He held the steering wheel with a mixture of determination and uncertainty, his fingers tense but excited, like someone stepping into adulthood for the first time. He had received his driver's license only a few days earlier, and this was not just a simple ride around the block. This evening was his first real trip on an open road, the kind where every decision felt meaningful, every turn felt like a declaration of independence. He kept his eyes trained on the road with an intensity that betrayed how seriously he took this responsibility. His shoulders were slightly raised, his spine straight, and every subtle movement of the wheel showed a careful deliberation. He wanted to drive perfectly smooth enough to impress, steady enough to prove he deserved this milestone. The faint glimmer in his eyes hinted at pride, but beneath it lingered a quiet worry that only someone new to the road could feel. Ronda sat in the passenger seat, her body relaxed as if she were simply enjoying a peaceful ride, but her attention never drifted far from her son. Years of discipline had taught her how to sense tension, even from the slightest change in breath, and she could feel his nerves radiating through every careful motion he made. Yet she felt no frustration, only a warm surge of pride. She had seen him fall off bicycles, stumble through early sports practices, and push himself through challenges that had nothing to do with fighting or strength, challenges of patience, responsibility, and growth. Watching him now at the wheel, she was reminded of all the small steps that had led them here. He was no longer a boy. He was becoming a young man, one learning how to navigate the world not just physically, but emotionally and morally too. She allowed herself to sink into the soft glow of the dashboard lights and the rhythm of the tires, letting the moment wash over her. She thought about how different his world was from the one she grew up in, the pressures, the expectations, the relentless scrutiny of society. In her youth, life had been a straight path: train, compete, win. Everything else blurred into the background. But for him, the landscape was far more complex, filled with choices, opportunities, and invisible threats she wished he never had to face. She wanted him to feel strong, but she also wanted him to remain gentle, thoughtful. They rarely had evenings like this, quiet, slow, free from schedules, cameras, or the intensity of training. He kept glancing toward the rearview mirror more often than necessary. At first, it was simple habit, the kind drilled into every teenager and driver's education. Watch the road, check the mirrors, control the speed. But as the glow of a distant vehicle's headlights began to appear behind them, his glances grew more frequent. Ronda noticed but did not comment. For her, it was just another car on another empty road. Nothing worth worrying about. But for someone driving alone at night for the first time, even the distant presence of another vehicle held its own weight. The car behind them dipped slightly on the hills and rose again, the flicker of its lights weaving across the pavement. The young driver adjusted his posture, gripping the wheel more firmly. He inhaled through his nose slowly, as if preparing for something he couldn't quite name. The world outside seemed to darken faster, the shadows stretching across the road like long fingers reaching for the car. The faint hum of the engine became louder in the stillness. The conversation earlier had been light about school, about training, about the possibilities that opened up once someone could drive themselves. Ronda had listened, smiling to herself at his enthusiasm, at how he carefully tried to sound grown up, though she could still hear the youthful thrill beneath every word he spoke. She remembered her own first taste of autonomy, the exhilarating mixture of fear and freedom. She had been younger than him when she first felt responsible for her own future, when she first stepped into the cage and felt the world staring at her. But now she understood something he didn't yet. Independence is only meaningful when life allows you to feel safe. As the lights behind them grew brighter, the evening's calm began to shift, not abruptly but subtly, like a whisper turning into a murmur. The car behind them was closer now, close enough that its headlights cast long, sharp shadows inside their cabin. He adjusted his speed slightly, just enough to stay well within the legal limit, the way someone would when trying to demonstrate innocence even without being guilty of anything. His breathing changed, shorter, quicker. Ronda glanced at him, placing a quiet hand on her knee, her expression calm but her senses alert. She told herself there was no reason to be concerned. They had done nothing wrong. The road was empty. The evening was peaceful, yet something about the way the approaching vehicle slowed and maintained its distance behind them made a small thread of awareness tighten inside her. It wasn't fear, just instinct, one she had learned to trust over decades of reading opponents, crowds, and danger long before it reached her. Then the world behind them exploded into a burst of red and blue light. The flashing colors washed across the trees, the asphalt, and the sides of their car, swallowing the gentle twilight and replacing it with a harsh, pulsing rhythm. The siren did not wail, but the lights alone were commanding enough. The young driver stiffened instantly, his breath catching in his throat. His hands tightened on the wheel until his knuckles paled, and his eyes widened at the sudden pressure of responsibility. He had expected his first police stop to happen someday, but not like this, not on a quiet evening with his mother beside him. Ronda remained composed, though she felt the subtle shift in the air. The way tension slid quietly into the car and settled like a weight across their shoulders. She could see the rise and fall of her son's chest become uneven, could sense the tremor of nerves that spread from his hands into the rest of his body. She leaned back slightly, her mind assessing the situation the same way she would before a fight. Not with aggression, but readiness. He activated the turn signal with a shaky hand and guided the car smoothly toward the edge of the road, slowing down carefully because he wanted to do everything right. The tires crunched lightly against the gravel of the shoulder, and the vehicle rolled to a complete stop. The flashing lights behind them did not dim. Instead, they intensified, filling the interior of the car with alternating streaks of red and blue that seemed to swallow every shadow. Inside the car, a silence formed, thick, heavy, and expectant. The boy's stomach twisted, his throat tightened, and he swallowed hard as he stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The world outside was suddenly enormous and threatening, while the space inside the cabin felt smaller, suffocating. He had imagined that a police stop would be routine, that officers would ask a few questions and send them on their way. But the intensity of the lights and the swiftness with which the patrol vehicle closed in behind them told a different story. Ronda turned her head slightly, observing the patrol car through the side mirror. The doors were still closed, but she could feel the energy behind that windshield, an energy that didn't match a simple traffic stop. She remained calm, yet her instincts sharpened. Years of facing danger had taught her how to recognize imbalance, how to see when a situation carried more weight than it should. Her son exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself, but the tremble in his fingers betrayed the storm brewing inside him. His pride from earlier seemed far away now, replaced by the raw unease of someone suddenly thrust into a world he was not prepared to navigate. The moment stretched, filled with the hum of engines, the bright pulse of lights, and the quiet apprehension that neither of them could ignore. And as the first shadowed figure opened the door of the patrol car and stepped out into the flashing lights, the peaceful evening that had carried them so gently forward fell away completely, giving way to something far heavier, something that neither of them yet understood, but both already felt settling across the air like a warning. The night had changed, the road had changed, and their journey, a moment of growth only moments before, was about to shift into something neither of them could have foreseen. The moment the patrol officer stepped out of his vehicle, the atmosphere around them shifted from uneasy to unmistakably threatening. The flashing lights carved his silhouette into something sharp and imposing, every movement amplified by the pulsing red and blue. The door slammed shut behind him with a finality that made the young driver flinch, the sound echoing across the empty stretch of road as if signaling the end of the quiet evening they had shared moments before. The boy's breath hitched again, his pulse quickening with each approaching footstep. He had imagined authority as something structured, professional, calm, predictable. But as the officer drew nearer, something about his posture, the deliberate heaviness of his stride, suggested a different kind of authority entirely. This wasn't composure, it was domination. Rhonda watched silently, her body still, but her awareness heightening with each second. She could read people the way a seasoned fighter reads opponents, through the tension of their shoulders, the angle of their steps, the energy radiating from their stance. And this officer radiated a simmering hostility she didn't like. He approached the car not with caution, but with a sense of entitlement, the kind that came from someone who believed he could not be questioned. He held a flashlight not for illumination, but as an unspoken threat, flicking its beam through the windows with unnecessary aggression. The light hit her son's face, blinding him for a moment, and the boy recoiled instinctively, squinting and stiffening under the harsh glare. The second officer exited the patrol car a few seconds later, but unlike the first, he didn't rush forward. He remained slightly behind, positioned at an angle that seemed less like support and more like surveillance, watching everything with a cold, evaluative expression. His stance carried the same heavy undercurrent of power, a readiness to escalate rather than observe. Their silent coordination suggested they had done this many times and not always with innocent intentions. Something in the way they moved lacked the balance of protocol. It held instead the edge of two men who expected compliance born of fear. The young driver rolled down the window with trembling fingers. Rhonda could hear the faint clicking of the controls, even over the low hum of engines, each click revealing more of his mounting panic. He tried to sit up straighter, tried to appear respectful, tried to embody the version of himself he believed the world wanted. Composed, polite, harmless. But when the officer approached fully, shining the flashlight directly into his eyes, all of that composure fractured beneath the reality of someone towering over him with undisguised hostility. The boy lifted his chin, attempting to maintain dignity, but his breath came unevenly. The officer didn't ask the routine questions first, he barked orders. Not through spoken dialogue, but through posture, through the aggressive wave of his hand, through the impatient tapping of the flashlight against the car door. He demanded movement, demanded obedience, demanded submission. It was clear from the very first moments that he had already decided the boy was guilty of something, that this was not a check, but a performance of power. Rhonda could feel her son's confusion and fear radiating through the enclosed space. He had never been in trouble, never broken laws, never even received a school detention. And yet here he was, treated like a threat simply for existing behind the wheel of his own mother's car on a quiet evening. She watched his fingers tightening around the edge of the seat, watched the rapid rise and fall of his chest, watched the way he swallowed hard in an attempt to steady himself. He was trying so desperately to do everything right, but it was clear that nothing he did would satisfy the officers who already viewed him as less than deserving of respect. When the officer gestured sharply for him to step out of the vehicle, the young driver hesitated for just a slow, fearful second. That tiny hesitation was enough to ignite irritation in the officer's expression. The boy finally unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out with a trembling caution that only made him appear more vulnerable. The officer moved toward him immediately, closing the distance between them so aggressively that the boy had to instinctively step back to avoid physical contact. But the officer didn't allow space. He advanced until he was looming directly over the teenager, their height difference amplifying the imbalance of power. Rhonda exited the car as well, moving with a calm she forced herself to maintain. She stood on the opposite side of the vehicle, watching, assessing, ready. Her presence did not soften the officer's demeanor. In fact, it seemed to make them even more hostile, as though her mere act of standing was perceived as a challenge. She could see from the way they glanced at her, from the flicker of recognition and annoyance in their eyes, that they were not interested in transparency or fairness. Instead, they carried themselves with the arrogance of individuals who believed they would never be questioned, let alone held accountable. The first officer began inspecting the boy's stance, criticizing his posture, his timing, even the way he breathed. It was not a legitimate evaluation, it was provocation. He pointed to imaginary issues with how the boy pulled over, pretended to analyze details that clearly didn't matter. It was a cruel game meant to unsettle him, and it was working. The boy's face flushed with embarrassment, his eyes darting in search of something familiar, something safe, something that would anchor him in the storm of intimidation closing around him. The second officer circled around the back of the car, positioning himself at the boy's other side. His presence created a silent trap, a physical barrier that left the teenager with no escape. Their coordinated movements transformed the space into a pressure chamber, each action intentional, each aggressive advance designed to provoke fear. That fear was exactly what they wanted. They watched the boy's shoulders slope under the weight of their scrutiny, watched his hands tremble, watched the subtle collapse of confidence that came when someone realized power was being used not to protect, but to control. Rhonda felt the first true warning bells ring inside her. She had been in countless confrontations inside cages and arenas, but never had she felt danger bloom so quickly, so unjustly, so inexcusably. She watched her son's chin dip slightly as he tried to maintain composure, as he tried not to let his fear show. But she could see it all, the tightening jaw, the stiff swallow, the trembling breath he tried so hard to conceal. He was complying with every command, yet the officers seemed intent on escalating the situation, on finding or creating a reason to assert more control. Her eyes shifted between them, tracking their movements as if they were opponents in the octagon. She noted the shift in their shoulders, the slight bend of their knees, the readiness of their hands. She could sense when a situation soured long before it erupted, and this one was souring fast. The first officer stepped closer to her son, now practically chest to chest with him, as though daring him to flinch. The boy's knees almost buckled from the pressure, his breath shuddering out in a way that made Rhonda's own heartbeat thicken. The officer demanded that he turn around. The boy did so immediately, without hesitation this time, but he moved with the rigid awkwardness of someone terrified of making a mistake. He kept his hands visible, held them obediently in front of him as he faced the hood of the car, but the officer still seemed unimpressed. The man's expression hardened, and he gave the boy a rough shove between the shoulder blades, forcing him to stumble forward. His palms smacked against the metal of the hood, and the sudden jolt made him gasp. Rhonda took a step forward, her body tensing as though responding to an attack. Her instincts screamed that something was wrong, terribly wrong. This was not how traffic stops worked. This was not procedure. This was harassment fueled by aggression, not safety. Every part of her training told her this was escalating into something dangerous. But she held her position for the moment, watching, analyzing, fighting her urge to intervene too soon. She needed to know the full extent of what these men were planning. The officer's posture shifted, his movements becoming sharper, crueler. He criticized the boy's compliance again, though the teenager had done nothing wrong. He rattled off silent commands with rough gestures, then physically manipulated the boy's arms as if punishing him for breathing. The quiet road, once peaceful, now held only the oppressive presence of authority, twisted into intimidation. Rhonda's pulse slowed, not with panic, but with focus. The familiar sensation of a calm before combat settled into her core. She wasn't reacting out of anger yet. She was preparing. She watched her son's fear grow, watched the officer's aggression intensify, and she saw the path the situation was taking long before the men realized how far they were pushing it. And as the officer's hand clamped onto her son's arm with needless force, spinning him with abrupt violence and pressing him harder against the hood, she felt something inside her begin to harden into a cold, heavy certainty. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was deliberate, calculated, a show of dominance inflicted on someone too young and too frightened to defend himself. The night continued deepening around them, but inside Rhonda, a different kind of darkness was beginning to rise, one that came from witnessing injustice firsthand, one that came from seeing fear in her child's eyes, one that no mother, and certainly no fighter could tolerate for long. The world had shifted the moment those lights ignited behind them, but now the shift was complete. The evening was no longer about driving lessons, independence, or dreams. It had become something else, something far more threatening, something that would soon demand a response she had not yet given, but was already preparing for. The instant the officer forced the boy's arms behind his back, the night took on a different weight. The sound of metal striking metal echoed faintly as his palms hit the hood of the car, the vibrations traveling up through his wrists and forearms. A thin layer of dust smeared under his skin, and the cold surface sent a sudden shock through his body. His breath stuttered, not from the temperature, but from the violence of the motion. He had never been handled this way before, never been treated as though he were something dangerous. The metal of the hood felt unyielding beneath his chest, pressing into him as though reminding him that he was trapped between people who held authority and a world that suddenly felt hostile. The officer's grip tightened around his wrist, twisting it upward at an angle far beyond what was necessary for compliance. The boy's breath hitched sharply, a small involuntary sound escaping his throat as pain shot through his arm like a burning wire. His fingers instinctively curled, but the pressure was too intense for him to resist, and the officer exploited that weakness. His other hand was seized and shoved into position behind his back, the movements brusque and careless. The boy tried to steady his breathing, struggling not to cry out, his chest constricting under the weight of panic and humiliation. Every breath felt shallow, scraped from a throat tightened by fear. Ronda felt the moment as a physical blow. She had watched people get hurt before, and the cage watched fighters fold under pressure, watched bones strain under holds and locks, but never had she seen such needless cruelty applied to someone who was not even resisting. She saw the trembling of her son's shoulders, the way his knees shook slightly beneath him, the way his face pressed against the hood, one cheek flattened against the cold metal. She could see the reflection of his wide, frightened eyes in the glossy surface of the car, and the sight cut through her like a blade. Heroism and strength mattered nothing when the person suffering was your child, helpless under the weight of authority gone wrong. The officer handling him showed no hesitation, no restraint, no professionalism in the way he moved. His fingers dug deep into the boy's flesh, not to maintain order, but to inflict dominance. The second officer hovered to the side, arms crossed, his gaze cold and detached, as though observing a routine drill. But there was something else in his eyes, a quiet satisfaction, the cruel kind found in people who enjoy watching others crumble under fear. His posture reflected none of the alert caution expected in a traffic stop. Instead, it was the posture of someone savoring the unfolding scene. The boy's wrists were pulled behind him so roughly that his shoulder blades pinched together, straining his joints. His muscles tensed involuntarily, and the officer took this natural reaction as justification to increase the torque. The teen stifled a gasp, but the sound still reached Ronda's ears. It echoed in her skull, reverberating alongside the rising storm of anger that had begun forming inside her. She felt as though something sacred was being broken. Not just his safety, but his innocence, his trust, his belief that the world held fairness in it somewhere. The metal cuffs came next, cold, sharp, and merciless. When the officer snapped the first bracelet around the boy's wrist, he tightened it not to secure, but to punish. The metal dug into the skin so deeply that bright red marks appeared almost instantly, swelling under the pressure. The boy's fingers twitched as numbness spread through his hand. When the second cuff closed around his other wrist, the officer twisted them to ensure they were as unforgiving as possible. The boy winced, his body stiffening as pain radiated through both arms, cutting through muscle and nerve like jagged glass. His breath came shorter, the sound trembling with each exhale. Ronda's heart hammered in her chest, but her expression remained calm, disciplined by years of controlling her reactions. Yet inside her, something surged, an ancient, primal instinct woven into every mother who has ever seen her child harmed. It was more than emotion. It was a force she had been trained to harness, but only released when absolutely necessary. She watched her son's jaw quiver as he fought the tears threatening to spill, tears not of weakness, but of helplessness. She saw him swallow hard, trying to remain steady, trying not to break. The sight only deepened her resolve. The officer leaned closer to the boy's ear, his breath harsh and hot. Though no words were spoken aloud in the narrative, the intention behind his actions was clear. He wanted to belittle, to intimidate, to reduce. His hand pressed against the boy's back, shoving him more firmly into the hood, flattening him until he could barely lift his head. The metal of the cuffs bit deeper as his arms were forced even higher, past the natural range of motion. His shoulders burned, his muscles strained, and the cold of the night seemed to amplify every ounce of discomfort. The second officer stepped closer now, circling behind the boy like a predator observing prey. His boots scraped against the gravel, each sound sharp and deliberate. He scrutinized the boy's trembling posture, his pinned arms, his rigid spine, as though assessing how much further they could push before the line broke. He wasn't looking for a reason to de-escalate. He was looking for any excuse to escalate. That realization dug its way into Ronda's chest, igniting a cold fury deeper than any she had felt in a ring. The boy's breathing shifted, no longer steady or controlled, but shallow and ragged. He tried to inhale deeply, but the pressure on his chest made it difficult. He felt exposed, violated, powerless. The humiliation settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He wanted desperately to look toward his mother, to find reassurance or understanding in her eyes, but he couldn't move his head enough to see. The hood of the car trapped him like a barrier between his fear and the one person he needed most. He blinked rapidly as tears burned the corners of his eyes, not from pain alone, but from shame. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, restrained and hurting, treated as though he deserved every rough twist of metal around his skin. Ronda stepped closer, her breath steady, but her muscles coiled tightly beneath her skin. She could feel her son's pain as though it had been inflicted on her own body. The urge to intervene pulsed like a drumbeat inside her. Every instinct, every fiber of her being urged her to tear the officers away from him, to shield him from further harm. But she forced herself to wait a moment longer, observing, gathering every detail. She had always believed in restraint, in measured actions, in not striking until the situation demanded it. And right now, the situation was inching rapidly toward that threshold. The officers continued their actions with no intent to stop. The first one jerked the cuffs upward again, testing how far he could push the boy's pain threshold. The teenager's knees buckled for a second, but the officer grabbed him by the back of the neck, stabilizing him in the most demeaning way possible. The boy froze under the harsh grip, the humiliation and terror merging into a paralyzing fog that made his limbs heavy and his mind scream for escape. He felt utterly powerless, as though the world had shrunk to this single moment of cruelty. Ronda's jaw tightened. She had seen enough. Her thoughts sharpened with clarity. This was no longer an issue of compliance or misunderstanding. This was brutality disguised as duty, cruelty performed under the shield of uniforms meant to protect. Her patience, stretched thin by restraint and logic, finally fractured. But before she moved, she absorbed the scene one last time. The contorted angle of her son's arms, the red marks bleeding across his skin, the tremble of his breath, the satisfaction lurking in the officer's stances. She knew with absolute certainty that if she did not intervene now, the harm would only escalate. Her son's face, pressed against the hood, reflected one overwhelming truth: hopelessness. And that expression was something she could never allow to remain, not in him, not ever. A final surge of protective fury unfurled within her. The moment had arrived. The balance had shifted. The officers had crossed a line they could never uncross. And as the night air thickened with tension, and the boy's silent suffering grew unbearable to witness, the storm inside Ronda reached its breaking point, preparing to erupt with a force that none of the men on that dark roadside were remotely prepared to face. The moment her son's expression dissolved into silent desperation, something ancient and immovable awakened inside Ronda. It was not a sudden burst of emotion, but a steady, gathering force like a tide that had been rising quietly beneath the surface, and had now reached the point where it could no longer be contained. The scene before her sharpened into painful, ruthless clarity. The brutal angle of her son's arms pinned behind him, the cuffs cutting into his wrists, the tremor in his shoulders, The way he couldn't lift his head from the cold metal the officer had pressed him against. His breath hitched, shallow and frightened, the sound almost lost beneath the hum of engines and the whisper of night wind. But she heard it. She felt it. It echoed through her chest with a resonance she had never known in any arena, any fight, any moment of her career. She stepped closer, her posture changing almost imperceptibly. Her stance widened, her weight shifted, and her breath fell into the slow, controlled rhythm she had perfected over years of combat. Her eyes narrowed, not with rage. Anger was too chaotic, too wild, but with focus. Pure, sharp, and tempered focus. Everything else fell away. The night, the flashing lights, the distant silence of the empty road. All that remained were the two men who were hurting her son, and the boy who was trying so desperately not to collapse under their cruelty. The officer continued to grind his hand into the back of the teenager's neck, forcing him down with the same carelessness one might use on an object instead of a human being. He lifted the boy's already strained arms another inch higher, ignoring the pained involuntary jerk of the boy's shoulders. The second officer stood nearby, his expression twisted with an arrogant anticipation of what might happen next. They had pushed past protocol, past reason, past decency, and neither intended to stop. Their confidence came from years of impunity, from the belief that their badges granted them the right to act without consequence. Ronda knew better, and tonight they would learn how wrong they were. She spoke no warning. There was no need. Her body moved before any words could form, guided by instinct and years of discipline. The first step she took toward the officer was measured, solid, but as inevitable as gravity. When he glanced up at her, irritation flickered across his face, as though he would chastise her for daring to come closer. That was the moment when he looked away from her son, breaking his focus, that everything shifted irreversibly. She closed the distance between them with a speed that defied the stillness of the night. Her hand shot forward, not recklessly, but with surgical precision, gripping the officer's wrist just above the hand that was twisting her son's arm. Her fingers locked into place with the strength of someone who had mastered the art of controlling an opponent's balance. She rotated her hips and shoulders in one fluid motion, redirecting his force downward and outward. The officer's arm bent back in a direction it was never meant to go, and his entire body followed helplessly, his stance crumpling beneath him. The sound that escaped him was a grunt filled with shock more than pain. But that shock quickly transformed into panic as he stumbled to the ground. His hand flew away from the boy's back, releasing the pressure instantly. The teenager gasped, finally able to draw a full breath, but didn't dare move yet, his body still frozen in the residual fear of the last agonizing minutes. Ronda did not pause to savor the success of the movement. There was nothing to savor. This wasn't sport. This wasn't a match with an audience. This was survival, her son's survival. She pivoted seamlessly toward the second officer, who had already begun reaching for his baton. His hand brushed against it, but he was too slow. He had underestimated her. They both had. Perhaps they thought she was simply a mother in distress. Perhaps they recognized her but believed a uniform outweighed a lifetime of combat training. They were wrong on every count. She intercepted him before he fully grasped the weapon, her forearms sweeping across his in a clean, powerful arc that jostled him off balance. His muscles stiffened in surprise, but she didn't give him time to recover. She stepped inside his defensive range, where his baton would be useless even if he had managed to draw it. Her hands found his collar and shoulder with practiced precision, and she shifted her weight in a controlled drop of momentum. Her hip moved under his center of gravity, and with a swift, deliberate motion, she sent him crashing to the ground. He landed hard, the impact punching the breath out of him. Gravel scattered beneath his body, and the baton he had failed to draw clattered uselessly a foot away. He reached for her in desperation, but she caught his wrist, applied pressure to the nerve, and forced his arm flat against the ground. His body writhed, but the pain was targeted as strategic. She knew how to control without breaking. She knew how to subdue without permanent harm. But she also knew how to make someone understand that further aggression was not an option. The first officer scrambled on the ground behind her, trying to regain his footing. She shifted smoothly, her body rotating just enough to keep both men within her field of awareness. Her foot slid across the gravel, anchoring her stance as she placed herself between the officers and her son, who was still bent over the hood in shock. She didn't speak. Her silence was more powerful than any warning she could have given. It was the silence of someone who had endured countless battles, someone who knew exactly how much force to use and how much she still had left if they dared to continue. The first officer attempted to rise again, but pain shot through his twisted shoulder, and he faltered, falling back onto his knees. He looked up at her then, and in his eyes she saw the first crack of realization. Not fear, not yet, but recognition. Recognition that the situation he thought he controlled had slipped entirely out of his hands. The second officer tried to push himself up as well, but she kept one foot firmly near his wrist, pinning him without even needing to touch him again. Her presence alone held him in place. Only once both men were subdued did she turn back toward her son. His arms were still locked behind him in the painful position they had been forced into, though the pressure was gone. His chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, and his entire body trembled, not from the aftermath of physical pain, but from the emotional shock of what had unfolded. His wrists were red and swollen, where the cuffs had bitten into his skin, and he winced as he tried to adjust his position. Ronda moved to him with a gentleness that contradicted everything she had done moments before. She touched his shoulder lightly, grounding him with her presence. Her hands worked carefully, expertly, finding the mechanism of the cuffs and relieving the tension that had been crushing his wrists. She eased them open, lifting the metal away from his skin with a tenderness only a mother could summon after unleashing such controlled fury. His body sagged with relief the moment the cuffs loosened. He didn't collapse, but his knees bent slightly, as though the weight of the world had suddenly shifted off him. He flexed his fingers, wincing at the tingling sting returning to them. His breathing steadied slowly, the panic ebbing with each moment she stood beside him. Behind them, the two officers remained where they had fallen, their confidence shattered along with their dominance. One clutched his shoulder, grimacing. The other lay flat on his back, staring up at the night sky as though unsure what had just happened. Their authoritative posture had dissolved completely, replaced by confusion, pain, and the dawning awareness that they had provoked someone far more formidable than they could have imagined. Ronda remained alert, her body still coiled in case either man made an aggressive move. Her eyes scanned them with the precision of someone who knew that even defeated opponents could be dangerous. But they didn't move. Not toward her, not toward her son. The threat they had posed only minutes earlier had evaporated, smothered under the weight of their own arrogance and her unyielding need to protect. Her son rubbed his raw wrists, turning toward her with an expression that held gratitude, disbelief, and lingering fear. She met his gaze, her own steady and sure, and though no words were spoken, everything was communicated in that exchange. He was safe now. She had seen to that, and she would continue to do so, no matter the cost. The night around them remained still, the flashing lights the only reminder of the chaos that had just erupted on the quiet road. But within that stillness, something fundamental had shifted. The officers had underestimated a mother's instinct. They had mistaken vulnerability for weakness. They had believed a badge gave them power without consequences. Tonight they learned the truth. Ronda looked at her son once more, then at the incapacitated men on the ground. She knew this was only the beginning of something larger. There would be fallout, accusations, questions. But those battles would come later. For the moment, she stood grounded between what had happened and what was coming next, ready to face whatever followed, because she had done what she had to do. And as the boy leaned against the hood, breathing freely for the first time since the lights began flashing behind them, the night air tasted different, heavy still, but no longer suffocating. The danger had been met, confronted, and destroyed. For now. For a long moment after the confrontation, the night held a tense and uneasy stillness. The road, once serene and empty, now felt charged with leftover electricity, as if the air itself had absorbed the violence of what had happened. The flashing lights from the patrol car continued to pulse, casting harsh, shifting colors across the scene. They fell over the two officers, one clutching his shoulder in a mixture of pain and disbelief. The other sprawled on the ground, His breath labored and uneven. They fell over Rhonda, still positioned protectively between her son and the men who had hurt him. And they fell over the boy, leaning against the hood, his chest rising and falling in heavy, shaky breaths as he tried to process what he had just endured. He moved his fingers slowly, testing them, wincing each time sensation shot through his hands like needles waking up a limb, long slept on. The marks on his wrists were angry and red, the skin swollen where the cuffs had bitten in. He raised his hands to inspect them more closely, his brow tightening as he saw the damage. His breath trembled, not because he doubted his mother's actions, but because he still felt the lingering echo of fear inside his chest, a fear that had been carved into him by those who were meant to protect, not punish. Rhonda's presence beside him worked like an anchor. She kept her stance firm, her senses alert, ready for any unexpected movement from the fallen officers. But her hand rested lightly on her son's shoulder, the contrast between her vigilance and her tenderness forming a protective cocoon around him. Each gentle touch helped him unravel the knots of terror still tangled inside him. She didn't need to say anything. Her steadiness spoke for her. The quiet was interrupted by the sound of distant engines approaching, faint at first, then louder, building into a steady drone that cut through the silence like a blade. Blue and white lights flickered far down the road, multiplying as more vehicles came into view. Within minutes, the lonely stretch of asphalt was illuminated by a series of arriving patrol cars, their lights adding to the chaotic dance of color already splashing across the scene. Doors opened, radios crackled, boots hit the pavement. The night, once so still, was suddenly alive with motion and noise. The new officers moved quickly, but with a different energy from the ones who had initiated the encounter. Their steps were measured, professional, but also tinged with confusion. They had been called to a scene involving downed officers, something that normally signaled a violent suspect, a high-stakes emergency. But when they arrived, what they found didn't match the story implied by the urgency of the call. 2 officers clearly injured, yes, but not from a criminal's wild resistance. Rather from a controlled, precise force that suggested expertise, not chaos. Their eyes fell on Rhonda first. She recognized the look instantly, the look of people trying to piece together an explanation for something that seemed impossible. Her posture was unshaken, her breathing steady, her expression calm, though her muscles remained coiled beneath her skin. She stood not as an aggressor, but as a protector, her body angled slightly toward her son. The officers noticed this too. They noticed the boy's swollen wrists, the marks left by the cuffs, the trembling still visible in his shoulders. And they noticed that despite his injuries, despite the trauma etched into his posture, he displayed no signs of being violent, dangerous, or confrontational. The contrast was undeniable. Some officers approached the injured men, kneeling beside them, examining their conditions, trying to elicit an account of what had happened. But the stammered explanations from the 2 subdued officers lacked coherence, the details spilling out in fragments, tangled with attempts to justify their earlier actions. Their story was inconsistent even to the untrained ear, saturated with defensiveness rather than truth. The new arrivals exchanged glances, subtle but telling. They had seen misconduct before, though they rarely spoke of it openly, and here it was again, laid bare in the dirt and gravel. One officer, older and more senior in posture, if not in age, approached Rhonda and her son. His expression was cautious, his eyes moving between them and the scene behind them, as he tried to piece together the fractured narrative. He spoke briefly, his gestures indicating questions, requests for identification, an attempt to understand. But Rhonda stayed composed, steady, responding through her posture and the calm, deliberate movements of her hands. The truth was visible in every detail around them, the boy's trembling, the marks on his wrists, the fact that neither she nor her son had attempted to flee or escalate once the danger had passed. The senior officer stepped closer to the boy, examining his wrists with a frown that deepened as he noted the severity of the marks. He turned to glance over his shoulder at the 2 injured officers, a shift in his expression revealing his growing suspicion. The imbalance between the boy's injuries and the officer's claims became more apparent with each passing second. This was not a scene of justified force. It was a scene of abuse interrupted. Rhonda watched the unfolding assessment quietly, but with the readiness of someone who understood that the battle was far from over. She had won the physical confrontation, but the psychological and legal storm was only beginning to form. She could feel it in the way the arriving officers murmured among themselves, in the questions they exchanged, in the unsure glances they shot toward the patrol car. The situation had changed, but it had not yet been resolved. More passers-by began to gather at the edge of the road, stopping their cars at a safe distance, drawn by the lights and confusion. Some stood by their vehicles, others pulled out their phones, recording the scene from several angles. Their screens glowed brightly in the dark, capturing every detail: her stance between the officers and her son, the condition of the boy's wrists, the positioning of the fallen men. The videos were flooding the internet already, spreading far beyond the quiet stretch of highway. Ronda sensed it, even if she didn't see it. Moments like this never stayed contained. Her son shifted slightly, instinctively stepping closer to her, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. He was drained not physically, though his wrists ached and his arms were sore, but emotionally. The weight of what had happened pressed down on him like an invisible force. He blinked hard, trying to stay present, trying to understand the rapid shift from violence to safety to chaos once more. But his mind lagged behind reality, struggling to catch up. Ronda's hand found his back, grounding him again. Her touch was firm enough to reassure but gentle enough not to startle. She could feel the tension slowly draining from his muscles, though not entirely. The fear still lingered beneath the surface, a shadow that would take time to dispel. When it became clear that no further immediate danger existed, a few officers approached Ronda again, their movements more tentative than authoritative. They seemed to recognize who she was now. Not just a mother, not just a woman who had intervened, but someone whose name carried weight beyond this road. But even so, their recognition didn't diminish the pressure of protocol. They needed statements, assessments, and understanding of events. She remained calm, answering through presence and cooperation, though inside she was still alert, ready to defend her son again if necessary. Eventually, a decision was reached among the officers, a quiet, careful consensus that tonight was not the time for accusations against her. Too many witnesses. Too much evidence contradicting the first officer's claims. Too much visible harm done to the boy. Holding her or her son would ignite a firestorm they were not prepared to face. And so one of the senior officers approached them, offering a gesture that indicated they were free to leave. They would need to participate in formal proceedings, later interviews, reports, statements, but not tonight. Not when the boy's wrist bore clear signs of brutality. Not when witnesses outnumbered badges. Not when the truth was already spreading through countless recording phones and social media streams. Another officer, one with a steadier, more empathetic demeanor, offered to escort them home. It was not protocol, but it was protection, a buffer between them and any further unsanctioned aggression. Ronda accepted the gesture, guiding her son back toward their car. The boy moved slowly, each step weighted by the shock still coursing through him. The interior of the car, once warm and comforting, now felt foreign, like a place forever altered by what had happened just outside it. As they pulled back onto the road, escorted by the patrol car following a respectful distance behind, the world outside seemed strangely quiet again. The chaos of the last hour faded into the hum of the engine and the distant glow of streetlights. But something fundamental had shifted in both of them. The boy stared down at his wrists, his fingers gently brushing the red marks. He wasn't crying. He wasn't speaking. He was simply existing in the aftershock, trying to understand how quickly safety could turn into danger, how easily authority could turn into violence. Ronda watched him from the corner of her eye, her heart heavy but firm. She knew what he was feeling. She knew the fear, the betrayal, the lingering sense of vulnerability. But she also knew something he didn't yet realize, that he had endured something that would change him, not just wound him. It would strengthen him, deepen him, open his eyes to the complexities of the world. And she would be there for every step of that journey. The road stretched before them, long and dark, but no longer empty. The escort's headlights cast a protective glow behind them. And as they drove toward home, toward the uncertain days ahead, the night air shifted once more. Not with fear this time, but with the beginning of something else, a reckoning, a demand for truth, a path toward justice that had only just begun. And for the first time since the lights had flashed behind them, her son exhaled fully, the breath shaky but real, as though reclaiming a piece of himself he had feared might never return. The following days unfolded with a strange mixture of stillness and relentless motion, as though the world around them was trying to decide whether to let the night's events fade quietly or erupt into something larger. But the decision was never truly theirs. The moment the videos began spreading first locally, then nationally, then far beyond the borders of their state, silence became impossible. What had happened on that dark stretch of road was no longer just a private moment of terror and defense. It became a story the world demanded to see, to analyze, to debate, and it became the center of an investigation that neither Ronda nor her son could avoid. The first sign came early the next morning, long before the sun had fully risen. Ronda sat at the kitchen table, a cup of untouched coffee cooling beside her, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant patter of morning traffic. Her son was still asleep upstairs, exhausted from a night spent tossing between nightmares and brief, restless pockets of sleep. The house felt strangely fragile now, as though everything inside it had been touched by the violence of the night before. The peaceful familiarity of home sat uneasily beside the memory of flashing lights and cold metal cuffs. Her phone buzzed repeatedly, notifications cascading across the screen faster than she could read them. Messages from friends, colleagues, journalists, strangers, videos shared thousands of times, screenshots of her face in the headlights, images of her son's swollen wrists, headlines ranging from praise to criticism. She let the phone buzz and ring without answering, her mind still too occupied with the image of her son pressed against the hood, the look in his eyes when pain overtook fear. By mid-morning, officials from the department's Internal Affairs Division reached out, requesting statements and offering reassurance that the matter was being taken seriously. It was a sterile promise, one she knew carried weight only because the world had already seen what happened. The images had left no room for dismissal or quiet cover-ups. Without the videos, without the witnesses, without the public outcry, she knew the truth might have been buried under paperwork and excuses, but now transparency was unavoidable. Ronda agreed to cooperate fully, not for herself, but for her son. She wanted the record to show what had happened, not her fight, not her strength, but the brutality inflicted on a boy who had done nothing wrong. She watched her son sit through the questioning that followed, his hand still faintly marked, his voice quiet but steady as he recounted the moments leading up to the assault. He chose his words carefully, describing not only what they had done, but how it made him feel, the fear, the helplessness, the confusion. The investigators listened, some nodding solemnly, others taking detailed notes. And through the process, something in him seemed to solidify, as though telling the truth out loud strengthened the parts of him that had been shaken apart. Meanwhile, the officers who had heard him were placed on immediate administrative leave. The news spread quickly. Complaints in their records, reports of excessive force, accounts from other victims who had never been believed. Internal Affairs began sifting through those past incidents, tracing a pattern that had long been ignored. Ronda heard it all through the steady drip of updates from officials and the rising roar of public opinion. People demanded accountability, not only for this incident, but for the trail of misconduct that the two officers had left behind them. Her son watched these developments unfold with a mixture of fascination and unease. He had once believed firmly in the system's promise of fairness and protection. Now he saw how easily it could falter. The experience left him more cautious, more aware of the shadowed corners of authority. But it also left him stronger. He started reading about civil rights, watching testimonies from others whose stories echoed his own, learning not only what had been done to him, but how others had found the courage to speak against it. Ronda observed this quietly, recognizing the resilience forming inside him. For her, the days brought another challenge. The public's reaction. Some hailed her as a hero, a mother who did what she had to when the system failed. Others condemned her for laying hands on officers, insisting she should have stayed back, stayed quiet, stayed compliant. But none of those opinions mattered to her. She knew what she had seen. She knew what she had protected. The bruises on her son's wrists were proof enough. Still, the attention weighed on her. She was used to cameras and crowds, but this was different. Fame in the ring came with applause. This came with scrutiny, judgment, and questions about her responsibility as a public figure. She took each challenge in stride, standing firm in her decision. She had acted not as a celebrity, not as an athlete, but as a mother. The world could debate the ethics of her choices, but she knew in her heart she would not change a single moment of what she had done. Eventually, the officers faced formal disciplinary hearings. The evidence was overwhelming. Witness testimony, video footage, medical evaluations of the boy's injuries. The inconsistencies in the officers' own accounts, all of it built a case that could not be deflected or diluted. They were found guilty of excessive force, abuse of authority, and violations of protocol. Their suspensions became terminations. Official statements were issued. Apologies, acknowledgments of wrongdoing, commitments to retraining and reform. The departmental leadership vowed to examine their internal practices, promising that what happened to her son would not be dismissed as an isolated incident. The apology came last, a formal, scripted statement delivered by the police department directly to Ronda and her son. It was offered with a polished sincerity, carefully worded to acknowledge harm without admitting liability. Yet within it, she recognized a genuine attempt at reconciliation, an institutional effort to restore trust. The words mattered less than the fact that they were spoken. Her son listened quietly as the apology was read, his expression thoughtful. When it was done, he nodded slowly. It didn't erase what had happened, but it marked the beginning of closure. Weeks passed. The storm of attention faded gradually. The world moved on to other stories, other controversies, other battles. But the impact on their lives remained. Her son walked with a new kind of awareness, one that came not from fear but from understanding. He no longer saw the world through the eyes of someone shielded from its harsher truths. He saw it now as someone who had survived something unjust and emerged wiser. One quiet evening, long after the headlines had faded, they found themselves back in the car together. The sky was painted in deep shades of purple, the headlights carving a soft path ahead of them. Her son sat behind the wheel again, his hands steady on the steering wheel. There was no tremor this time, only calm confidence. The marks on his wrists had healed, leaving behind faint reminders of that night. But his spirit had grown around them, filling the space with strength instead of fear. The road stretched out before them, open and endless. The quiet no longer felt heavy. It felt peaceful again, like it had the night before everything changed. And as they drove, mother and son, side by side once more, there was no fear in the cabin, no dread, just understanding and resilience, shaped by what they had endured and strengthened by how they had faced it. Ronda watched him drive, her chest warming with the same pride she had felt the first time he'd taken the wheel. Only now it was deeper, more profound. He had faced a cruelty that would have crushed many, yet here he was, steady, thoughtful, stronger than before. And she had been there for him, not as a fighter, but as a mother who refused to let injustice take root in the heart of her child. The road continued forward, and they followed it, not running from the past, but carrying the lesson of it into whatever came next. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video with your friends. Check out the next episodes and other stories on the channel. You won't want to miss them. See you in the next video.